you tell us the genesis of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead?
The movie or the play?
The beginning.
The beginning.
Yeah.
Well, I was in a car with a friend, in fact, my agent as well as my friend, Ken Ewing, and he suggested a play about Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. I'd been to see a Hamlet at the Old Vic. This is in London, of course. And we were coming back from a television studio. We had what turned out to be an abortive meeting with some story editor on a series. I think I was trying to get a job. This was, I suppose, in 1964, maybe, 3. And I think it's the only time this has ever happened, that somebody says, you know, you should write a play about something X, and you think, oh, that's a good idea. The other 100 times, you're not remotely interested in what people think you should be writing a play about. The other day, I was on a television interview, and I sort of made the mistake of saying I wasn't writing anything and would like to find something, and I'm now already in a receipt of half a dozen hopeless ideas, so delivered to my hotel.
So, and had you had written a play, a full-length play prior to
yes,
Rosencrantz?
I was a reporter, a journalist in Bristol in the west of England, and I wrote a play in 1960 while I was still freelancing on the local paper. And then I wrote another play, a one act, which might exist somewhere, perhaps not. It was called The Gamblers, and it was a death cell play, and the famous agent at the time said, oh, all you young people, you're always writing death cell plays. So that was mine. Then in '64, I was lucky enough to be chosen as a promising young playwright and sent to Berlin for a few months with half a dozen other promising young playwrights, young artists in general. And this was a Ford Foundation enterprise at a time when it seemed important to keep Berlin culturally alive. You know, it was as it were cut off. And we were housed and well fed in a house until we could do anything we like in the way of writing things. And I wrote a short piece about Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. I think it was actually, I'm not sure if it exists anymore, but it took place in England. It was really about what happened to them when they left the action of Hamlet and got to England. And when I got back from Germany in the autumn of '64, at some point I started to write the play which now exists. I found that in order to explain them in England, I had to go backwards through the action of Shakespeare's Hamlet until I emerged through the other end, beyond and before the beginning of Hamlet. And I suppose I must have been writing it 64, 65, and then in '66 it was performed finally at the Edinburgh Festival.
Was it performed as a one-act play, or
no? It was a 2-act, 3-act play.
But it started as a.
I started again.
Oh, I see.
It started as a extended sketch, really, and when I got back to England from Germany, I wrote the play proper, and then there was about a year where some of this history I didn't discover for myself until many years later. It was sent to the Royal Shakespeare Company, not by me. I can't remember how that happened. And a very young associate director, a child at the Royal Shakespeare Company called Trevor Nunn, was given this play to do in a special season outside their main house. And there were going to be 3 plays, and mine was going to be one of them. And the money fell through, so none of these 3 productions happened. And the Royal Shakespeare Company said, look, we'll just be hanging you up for I don't know how long. Why don't you take the play back and give it to somebody else? Or perhaps they even passed it on, because it reached a director called Frank Hauser at Oxford. And through him, it reached a bunch of students who each year performed a play at Edinburgh. By now, it was 1966, and they did it in August of '66 at Edinburgh as a student production in a church hall, and it went on from there.
It went to the National Theatre from there?
Well, not precisely. I mean, the text did. I mean, the student production did its 2 weeks or whatever it was. And I went back to London and picked up my life, but...
As a reporter?
I was actually, by that time, I'd got a job writing radio for the World Service. So I was living on that kind of freelance writing. I'm not sure what else I was doing. I'd written a novel. And I got back to London, and what happened was that one of the newspapers, The Observer, gave it a very, very good notice on the Sunday, and Kenneth Tynan, who was the dramaturg at the National Theatre, he asked to read it, and he did read it, and the National Theatre took the play and produced it in April '67.
How did Derek Goldby come
Derek Goldby, who directed the first professional Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, was on the staff of the National Theatre. He was one of 2 or 3 associate or assistant directors who occasionally were sort of tossed a little bauble by Laurence Olivier. So he was thrown this and said, okay, you can, I think actually Derek once told me that he saw it on a desk and said, who's doing this? And nobody seemed to know. And he said, well, I'd like to do it. And perhaps life in those days was simpler, and people got jobs, plays to produce in a rather casual way.
And did Olivier have much to do with it?
Well, I remember going to a meeting with Olivier and Tynan and John Dexter, the late John Dexter. I don't remember much about what happened at that meeting. I think they were asking me what I felt about some kind of casting meeting, perhaps it was. Olivier came to rehearsals once or twice, and I remember he sort of came in and watched from a corner. The National Theatre, the glory of British theatre, at that time occupied by way of offices a long, low wooden hut built on wasteland near the present site of the theatre. And it was in this hut, I suppose the, as it were, equivalent of the log cabin. And in this wooden hut, there were these little rabbit warrens of offices. I mean, I know Ken's office was just big enough for 2 chairs and a desk. And Olivier's office wasn't much bigger than that. Anyway, Olivier came to rehearsal just once or twice. Of course, we all froze like rabbits in the headlight. And I remember, the only thing I remember is that as he was leaving the room, the rehearsal room one day, you know, he, as it were, offered some kind of note to the actors or the director, I forget what it was, and he left. And at the door he turned and said, just the odd pearl. So with the odd pearl, we carried on and we opened. Those days were really very different. You know, I'm speaking to you after an opening here in New York, and although this production had been on in London, this play called Jumpers, I don't know how many scores of performances it had in London before we got here, weeks and weeks, and we still had 2 weeks of previews. You know, you have previews, you have lots of time to finesse and fix things. And back in *67, when I think back how extraordinary it all was, we had a dress rehearsal one night, and the next night the critics came in, and the following morning you got these notices, and on you went.
And it was a great success.
It was.
And how did that change your life? You were a drama critic at that time? You were a journalist?
I had been a kind of a drama critic. I'd worked on a weekly sort of arts magazine. I reviewed theatre for it. Previously, I'd reviewed theatre in a quite inept way on the local newspaper. Did it change my life? Yes, it did. Because I suppose I was able to relax about earning a living in the immediate future. You know, I didn't need a huge amount of money, and obviously there was going to be wages coming in now for a while. So that was, I just got married then. So it was important in that way. It meant I could sort of just think about what I wanted to do as a writer.
And the play came to New York soon after?
I think it came to New York the same year, in the autumn.
And what was that experience like?
I think it somehow settled my view of New York and my feelings about being in New York ever after. It was a bit of a mayhem. I mean, one was living at some kind of higher level of intensity. Everything seemed very, very much more important than it had seemed in London. I mean, on Broadway, it is more important. And I still feel much the same way 35 years later? More, 36 years later. Last night, I said to David, who directed Jumpers, that I'd forgotten what a first night in New York was like. A Broadway opening was much more first nighty than first nights in London. And there's a great sense of occasion and a great sense of things mattering and a lot hanging on to how things went. And in '67, that feeling was intense. But I was quite naive, really. I just assumed that the play would be fine. It was fine in London. Why shouldn't it be fine in New York? And I remember getting John Wood and Brian Murray first night gifts, you know, quite sort of nice ones. And I remember John saying, "Look, this is madness. You know, you don't know you're a success yet." And I thought, "Oh, don't be silly. Of course we're a success. You know, it's not going to change, is it?" And it didn't. But in fact, that was really I was just speaking from ignorance.
And it was David Merrick who produced the play?
It was David Merrick who produced Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, and that was my first encounter with David. He was always, you know, very supportive.
And the second play after that, the next play, not the second play, was Jumpers, yes?
Probably. I think I was in New York with a short play called Dirty Linen, and actually I think the next play was probably The Real Inspector Hound, which was a play which was the year after Rosencrantz, and then Jumpers and so on.
How did this movie come into being?
It certainly didn't come into being because I wanted there to be a movie of Rosencrantz. I wasn't pushing for it, but there were one or two people who were, and I don't remember how long these incompleted conversations went on. I suspect for a year or so. And I also remember at one point writing down a list of possible directors for this film. There must have been 20 names on this list, either suggested by other people, perhaps by you, some by me. And I remember being baffled by this list because I couldn't see why any of these people shouldn't make the film or should. I didn't know what to go on. I didn't know what the criteria were. And I'm pretty sure that I ended up directing it myself because paradoxically, it seemed to be easier to get the money for the movie if I were doing it. I'd never directed a film, and therefore, I suppose, since nothing was known about my talents as a film director, there was just a possibility that I was Orson Welles, whereas somebody who'd actually directed the film before, you know he isn't. And I think the idea of the author directing his own work was somehow more interesting. And I got the impression that there was some advantage in my directing the film, some advantage when it came to getting the whole production together. But that wasn't the main reason I ended up doing it. The main reason was that I saw early on that one ought not to simply treat the play as some kind of shooting script shorn of its directions. I sort of felt that the text would have to be different in quite a lot of ways. And I knew pretty much instantly that that I was the only person who wouldn't be defending the text all the time. Even by whatever year it was, we're talking about the early 90s, I think. You know, by then it was a kind of modern classic, and what it needed was to have things slashed out of it and things bolted onto it and a bit of, you know, cherries and icing shoved around on top of it, and whatever. And I found I didn't seem capable of simply writing a movie script to give to somebody. A lot of it you get while you're doing it, you know. So I think I directed the film finally. I think the reason I did it finally was that I was the only person who was prepared to commit some kind of violence upon the stage text.
You had written an earlier screenplay version. The play had been optioned by...
I'm glad you reminded me. Way, way back, you know, 20 years earlier, when the play was here in New York, it was bought by a film studio. I'm not sure
MGM.
which one. Sorry?
It was MGM.
It was MGM, was it?
Yes.
And I know that there was a sort of burst of activity between regimes at MGM. There was some person who was head of production, and there was an American agent involved, and this property was sold to AGM, and John Borman wanted to direct the film. He wanted to do it. And I did write a script then, but I say that, although it's technically not really true. I didn't write a film script. I didn't know how to. And I wrote a very long film version of the stage play with a great deal of instruction to the camera, which I didn't understand. And on the surface, there was activity which suggested that this was a real film which might well be made. I actually went on a recce, I remember, to Elsinore to have a look at Elsinore and other places. And then there was a regime change at MGM, and that was the end of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, the movie. So I think it was quite untrammeled by the time Michael Brandman and Manny Eisenberg heard about it.
Do you remember how the casting of Gary Oldman and Tim Roth came about?
I remember Tim coming to my flat on what I thought was a more or less purposeless courtesy call, because he just wasn't what I thought of as being Guildenstern. But he was, I think he was sort of pushing for it. And he came around, and fortunately I sort of began to see sense after a while. I began to see that actually he was the most interesting actor I'd talked to, met, and so on for a long time. And I sort of pushed aside my rather conventional idea of what kind of actor should be playing Guildenstern, and was glad to have somebody who was so kind of strangely edgy and interesting. As for Gary, how did that come about? I do remember meeting Gary and Uma Thurman, who they were a couple then. We were in New York in some bar, pub, forget it. And I didn't know this until later, but Gary, he said he'd like to do it. But Gary was a very, very hot actor. He was being asked to do a lot of things, and I think that Rosencrantz was actually being squeezed out in one way or another. And I had an evening with Gary and Uma in a restaurant or a bar, And later, she told me this much later, I think, she said, oh, look, we got on very well, that was the point. We had we chimed together very well. The three of us, in fact. And I remember Uma told me later that she said to Gary, oh, listen, you are going to do it. You have to do it. Entirely, really, for social reasons, I think. So we all ended up in Zagreb after all.
Having made the decision to direct the movie, how did you, and not having directed a movie before, you mentioned that you took a crash course in directing from Mike Nichols.
Did I? Was it on the telephone or?
No, he was directing Working Girl.
Oh, yes.
And you visited the set.
Yes, it wasn't really a crash course in directing, but I just thought I'd better kind of wake up and smell the movie a little bit. The real smart move was actually getting Peter Bijou on board, who had recently won the Oscar for lighting
Mississippi Burning.
Mississippi
Burning.
Burning, thank you. And Peter brought along with him a kind of A-list team of operator and grip and focus puller. And I mean, I think that I had enough nous to know that the best thing is not to pretend that I knew how to do everything, and to lean on Peter and his team quite heavily, which I did. And there was such a wonderful gang of people who made this film. I mean, I think of it as being a very enjoyable, happy memory. I mean, obviously there were some fraught moments, the odd telephone flung at the wall, that kind of thing. But I don't, of course, to this day, think of myself in any way as a film director. I'm not a film director, and don't wish to be a film director. And probably, if I made the film again now, I'd make it different and I think better. But with, you know, with help from all sides, we actually did come in, as far as I know, within budget and within the calendar, didn't we?
We did. We
didn't overrun, and we didn't overspend, I don't think. So in that sense, I was a triumph, I think, in that department. And I'd had quite a lot of experience, I had quite a lot of experience in post-production from other movies. So I was familiar with the editing process. I'd been involved in it on different films, and I really enjoyed it. And I loved the post-production part of making Rosencrantz as well. It was, as an experience, the whole thing was an absolute thrill, as a matter of fact. And you know, I watched the film a year ago and thought, oh dear, I should have done that there, and so on, as one does. I wanted to trim it. I think if there were a director's cut of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, it might be the only movie where the director's cut was shorter than the producer's.
The film went on to win the Golden Lion Best Picture Award at the
Yeah.
Venice Film Festival.
Yes.
What was that experience like?
Well, I'd never been involved in a film festival before, except as a kind of visitor with nothing to do with any of the movies. And the Venice Film Festival is a very good festival to go to. I mean, Cannes is a different thing. Cannes is a huge marketplace, and Venice, as far as I remember it, 10 years ago anyway, was well, obviously a bit smaller and more concerned with what was on the screens, perhaps. The chairman of the judges was Gore Vidal, and he I believe, was the person who went out to bat for this film more than anybody. Goodfellas was in the festival that year, which I went to see, and I thought, oh my God, I'll vote for that. You know, it was just an extraordinarily strong film. And then I had to go to Toronto to represent our film in Toronto. And I think I was either on my way there or on my way back when I heard that Rosencrantz had won the Golden Lion. So I suddenly had to go back to Venice rather unexpectedly. And I mean, it was sort of wonderful to win it, but most of one's head, at least 51% of one's head, was telling one that on a certain level, these prizes are kind of nonsense. They're to do with some kind of lobbying process and infighting and whim. And the last thing that an award is actually a sensible calibration of something's quality. It doesn't really, you can't put works of art into a pecking order. So getting an award was some kind of a convention which was very welcome and happy and all that. And I certainly didn't think that meant that my film was better than any other film at the Venice Festival. That would be an absurd attitude to take towards awards. So with this kind of rather blithe attitude in my head, I sort of walked into a kind of post-award thing. And there was the director of Goodfellas, whom I knew very slightly. And I sort of cheerfully went up and was very glad to see him again. And I sort of sensed there was a certain amount of, coldness. I suddenly realized that this was being taken very, very seriously. And looking back, he was completely in the right. It was kind of, I actually like our film very much, and I was very proud of it, and I still am, and I thought a lot of it was sort of really nice, really terrific, and some of it I'd like to be different. But all that said, it clearly was not, it wasn't Goodfellas. I mean, Scorsese is some kind of film genius who's made all these amazing films. So it's a kind of ridiculous situation. And it took a while for the atmosphere to melt a little bit, to thaw out. And that's all I remember about Venice.
I'm sure you've heard them all before, but allow me to ask you some of the most frequently asked questions about Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. First of all, what's it about? It's certainly a question I never asked myself. I don't think writers go in with that kind of question. It had an instant and direct appeal to me as a dramatic and comic situation. I'm now talking about the play which preceded the film. But they're both the same animal and they're both about the same thing. But what is that? Well, all right. It's about two people who are knocking around inside the finite parameters of an invented story invented by William Shakespeare. They have roles to play, and they don't really know what's going on in the story in which they've become involved. They're not told what they're there for and what's really happening. And to my reading, they go to their deaths without ever having understood what the whole thing was about and why they're now dead. So, if you like, it's about that. And even as I'm explicating it to you, I can see that that's quite a kind of promising myth for ourselves and our lives. That we're here, we don't know everything that's going on. A lot of what we're told is lies, and we try to make sense of things. We try to preserve ourselves, and we die. It was also a film, to answer your question on a slightly different level,
It was a film by a writer who was in some way in love with Samuel Beckett's work. Clearly, Waiting for Godot had something to do with the duologues in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. I mean, the rhythms were being picked up from Beckett, but also Beckett's novels had some kind of influence on the play. Just that particular tone of helpless, wry bemusement in the face of death and in the face of mystery, unknown, peripheral visions of what's going on in your life and what it all means. So that's one way of saying, what is it about? I've been followed around for decades now by a flip remark I made at the time. And I'm not sure that I want to give it further currency, but to hell with it. And I suppose it must have been the first night of the play in New York, or some such period, at a time when I had been somehow exposed to an unbelievable amount of questioning and interviewing, and I was really getting sort of irritated by the whole thing and defensive. And somebody came up and said, "What is your play about?" And I said, "It's about to make me rich," as a very incautious, completely stupid, evasive remark. And this quote, it comes up every year. It was one of those times one shoots one's mouth off for one reason or another. And so I learned to treat, she was a journalist, I didn't know that, but I learned to treat questions with more respect if I can.
Why do people keep mixing Rosencrantz and Guildenstern up?
I suppose, I don't know that they do in our film. I think that people who saw Hamlet a few years ago look back on it and they can't quite remember which one was which.
Claudius can't seem to get a handle on who's who.
I'm not sure if that's really what those lines mean. I'm not sure whether it means that he's got them. I mean, in our film, that's true. That's the way that's the spin we put on that exchange. You know, thank you G, thank you R, thank you R, thank you G. I suppose that in some way it appealed to me that they were so marginal that the king didn't quite even know which of them was which. Yeah.
But they themselves mix each other.
Oh, that's pushing the envelope, isn't it? They do that because once somebody else casts doubt upon which of them is which, then because of their existing entirely inside this artifice, they have nowhere to go for the true gem. They have nowhere to go to validate one theory or the other as to which one is which. That makes sense to me. That makes logical sense to me, that if there's a doubt as to who is who, there is no reference or tribunal to which they can turn to get the truth.
Why did they go to the castle in the first place?
Well, they're summoned. The king actually, or the queen particularly, wished them to keep an eye on the prince, who is clearly in some kind of emotional state, and they're worried about him. I think there's a certain amount of fear and guilt attached as well in the attitude towards Hamlet. and they're there as a couple of spies, minders, brought in to try to find out what's disturbing him, try to cheer him up.
Everyone dies ultimately in this piece.
Yes.
Shakespeare's design.
Yes.
But somehow death in your piece takes on different forms.
Yes.
What were you striving for?
Well, there are frames within frames, aren't there? The troupe of players perform a play in which there are deaths, but those are clearly acted out deaths. And the whole cyclical shape of my play ensures that they come back from the death, from the dead, because they have to, as it were, enter a new Hamlet.
Right.
There's probably a new one every week somewhere. So yes, there's something which isn't very definitive about their deaths. Rosencrantz, I remember Gary doing this, I don't know how many takes. He was asking for more takes than I wanted, actually, and I was letting him have them because I wasn't quite sure where the best one was anymore. But he has a long monologue about, do you ever think of yourself as actually dead, lying in a box with a lid on it? Perhaps everybody at some time or another thinks about that. There's a Philip Larkin poem, I think the last substantial poem he ever wrote, I believe. I think that's the poem this comes from. He says, most things may not happen, this one will. That's quite a thought. Most things may not happen, this one will. And that was a poem by Philip Larkin, who indeed is now dead.
Scholars debate over whether Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead is existentialism or absurdism. Which is it, and do you care?
I think we'd be testing the patience of the audience to do what would be necessary as a first step, which would be to define existentialism on the one hand and absurdism on the other. And I don't know that it's worth going there. I certainly didn't care while I was writing it. To me, it's not an absurd play, actually. Absurdism, in my mind, is associated with some kind of cavalier attitude towards the rules of logic, for example. There's some sort of overlap between surrealism and absurdism. It doesn't appeal to me. I enjoy working inside rules, really. And so it's not an absurdist play at all. Existentialism, this is really it's a Francophile idea. It's a French, in fact it's Sartre, I suppose, the idea that existence precedes essence, and then you'd have to explain that one. I can see that we're actually in an area of the interview which will never see the light of day, thank God, because I have to get out of this thicket. If the play, and indeed the film, represent existentialism, if it's an existentialist piece, that in a way is a kind of retrospective, almost a byproduct of the process of writing it. I don't think writers go into what they work on, what they write. They don't go into it with a sense of what it is when and if it will be ultimately viewed from a critical perspective, where one can, as it were, neatly put it into this box or that box, or associated with that school or this school. I don't think writers ever go into a work thinking like that. I certainly don't. I said earlier that the attraction was, very pragmatic. It was a simple attraction. It was an attraction towards a situation which had dramatic and comic possibilities. I like the word show, actually. I could see it working as a show. I probably never said that to myself, but theatre is a pragmatic art form. And I think that every work of art in the theatre which has, as it were, paid its way, it's sort of, that it's still there. I think that whether it's Oedipus Rex or Waiting for Godot or Charlie's Aunt or Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, whatever it is, there's something it's being judged by which cannot be deflected into expensive words like existentialism, theatre of the absurd. Those terminologies become almost an intrusion on what's really there, because I think that the art form is a storytelling art form, and it lives or dies by its storytelling. And perhaps writers are the last people to care what kind of label attaches to what they write.
I'll get out of the thicket here. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead is the only one of your plays as of yet that's been made into a film. Why is that?
Well, there have been one or two, not attempts exactly, approaches and feelers. More than one person has wanted to make a film of Arcadia, for example. And I thought I'd have a go myself at some point. It's difficult to answer that. Years ago, Sidney Pollack wanted to make a film of The Real Thing. That was another one. And I suppose that unlike Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, these were plays where I didn't see any point in doing anything other than pointing a camera at them. And then one asks, well, is there any point in that? I mean, there have been movies which have essentially been the stage play. I mean, I think one of the better things Richard Burton did was Look Back in Anger, for example. There was a Sidney Lumet movie of Long Day's Journey into Night. I mean, the script by Eugene O'Neill, long dead. And, well, in those two cases anyway, the films were very good films. And yet they're not part of the living history of the cinema. Something is lacking there. In the case of Arcadia, I think I started by trying to deconstruct it. And then the whole thing turned into its own negative. It didn't seem to be a film of Arcadia anymore, and therefore why were we doing this? That's one level. Another level is I think that I got a bit lazy. I find it difficult, on the one hand, to give my work to somebody else. Do what you will, come what may, and so forth. On the other hand, I'm not very good at getting re-enthused about work which I'd done years earlier. I'm not very good at getting reignited and sort of being creative and enthusiastic. I'd rather move on to something new. So it sort of fell between those two stools, really.
Why do you write plays?
I got into writing plays because at that time people of my age wanted to get into the theatre for reasons of vanity. Theatre was the medium to which a disproportionate amount of attention was being paid from the middle 50s to the middle 60s. I think I wrote my first play in 1960. I also write plays because I got inside the theatre, physically inside an actual theatre, writing about theatre, meeting people who worked in the theatre. This was a theatre in the city where I was working as a journalist, and I liked the smell of it and the sense of what was happening there. So on that level, I like working in the theatre. If you compare it with writing a novel, for example, I think that theatre is just for me, it's just a more exciting place to work. I was going to say that there's something self-contradictory here, because I value solitude and I work in solitude and I don't share what I'm writing with other people and so forth. But when it comes to the event which succeeds the text, when it comes to the actual event where you're talking about what it'll look like and what it'll sound like and who will do the acting in it, all that I find very exciting, and it makes me alive. It makes it, I really feel part of something. If you contrast it, on the other hand, with film, then I write theatre because theatre is still the writer's medium in the way that film is said not to be. Though my view is that nobody has got a film until they've got a writer. Nevertheless, I can see that there are perfectly good reasons why the writer of a screenplay becomes the amanuensis of the director. And I've never written an original screenplay in my life. I've been involved in quite a number of films, but they've always come from a novel written by somebody else or an existing screenplay and so on. And I think if I had a precious idea of my own, a treasured idea, I'd have to seek to direct it myself if it were a movie, because I think the writer really is there to serve the director, and I would want that director to be me.
And what difference is there between writing plays and writing screenplays?
Well, the deepest answer is that there's no difference, in the sense that there shouldn't be any rules about what constitutes a good film. There shouldn't be any inhibitions or impediments as to what a really good film is or could be. One ought to be able to hold an entire audience with a monologue on film. In the real world, if you like, there's an opportunity in film to make something which is very, very volatile and is completely unrestricted about where it goes at any given moment. So even on a page, a screenplay doesn't look like a stage play. But while I've been working in the theatre production has loosened up in quite an extraordinary way. I think 30 or 40 years ago, there was still a kind of framework attitude towards the construction of a piece of theatre, that there was still an attitude of it being structured in a certain way. But actually theatre is so free nowadays that it's less true that a screenplay should look very different from a stage play. If you're asking me as somebody who simply writes, I've never had to compare the two, because I've never had to write anything from scratch, in the movies.
You won an Oscar for Shakespeare in Love. Did that change your life or your career in any way?
No, it didn't. Quite honestly, no. I got asked to do a lot of movies, but I always had been asked to do a lot of movies. I mean, a lot. I'm approached about one film or another. Oh, I don't know. Probably averages a few times a month. And that's been going on for years. And as for the films that I've got myself involved in, there are very few. On the whole, I'm not really attracted to very much. I don't feel, oh yes, you know, this is for me. Here's something that I really enjoy doing and I know what to do with it. Mostly it doesn't trigger me in that way, the things that come my way. That's true of everybody.
What is the criteria that will trigger you?
What is it? Well, one aspect of it, this isn't quite answering your question in the way that you'd like, but one aspect of it is that as years go by, you get to work with this person and that person, and sometimes you come aboard a movie because it's being produced or directed by somebody who you get on with well and who you feel that will listen to your voice and you will understand their voice and so on. I think spending as much time as possible among one's friends is quite an important part of life as you get older. You don't want to spend it in some, way where you're just fighting something or somebody. So you tend to trust situations if you know the people involved. But when you said what are the criteria for movies you like to get involved in as a writer, I'm not sure that there are any. Sometimes it's the subject matter, sometimes it's simply the original authorship. People, of course, tend to think that you'll be attracted to this or that on the basis of the work you've done in the past. And no doubt there are many writers who do work that way, that in a way that they're channeling themselves into a given area of interest, and you can somehow sense that this will appeal to that writer because of that writer's track record. But I feel I'm a much more eclectic sort of person. It seems to me that the things I've done and chosen to do have less in common with each other, and so it's harder to figure out what I'd like to do next from looking at what I've done in the recent past. It's hard for me too. I don't know where to look. If I'm looking for a subject, I don't know where to look.
Do you still have ambition? Do you have an objective?
As regards being a writer for the theatre, yes, I do. Most other ambitions have fallen away, really. I think I would like to do less work generally, or rather just work on one thing for quite a long time, rather than to keep trying to spin this plate and that plate. One of the things about working in the theatre, which is very different from working in film, is that in the theatre the writer is very, very much part of the process when a new piece is being produced, when it's being rehearsed, and when it's making its way towards being performed and seen. A writer is central to the whole process. And with films, by the time a film is actually in production, the writer is thousands of miles away, literally or metaphorically, and working on something else. And his presence isn't particularly required. And I don't know, I really feel I'd like to have people be under the impression that I've retired, but to work in secret.
You once said it's a condition of maturity that almost everything is wrong all the time, and happiness is a borrowed word for something else, a passing change of emphasis. What did you mean by that?
It was clearly quite a pessimistic moment, wasn't it? I don't feel quite the same way in this current decade. But yes, from the time when I was grown up enough to have responsibilities over other people, especially tiny people, and you know, the house, the roof over one's head and everything else, and school and so on. Life, I thought, was mostly tension. Fitting everything in, the work and the family commitments and responsibilities. And I suppose that I associated happiness with some kind of absence of commitment, as though it was something really very detached, that there were no calls upon one, that one was being left alone for precious little periods in the middle of the tumult of everyday life. And to me, happiness must have been associated with those rare times when you were just left alone. And most of life consisted of, you know, I don't mean in a dramatic way, but perhaps some mild way, most of life consisted of replacing one problem with another. And the release from that labor seemed for a moment to be happiness. Now, I have a lot of time to myself. So, in fact, I am happier. It doesn't say very much for my character, I believe, these words I'm now saying, but it is true that I do value, I value the solitude which constitutes a good part of my life.
You are a happy man?
I am a happy man, and here we are talking in Manhattan. Where life is sort of edge to edge with yellow cabs and noise and bustle and meetings. That is not happiness. I mean, it's perfectly okay, but only because I know it's going to end and get back home where nothing of that is going on. I don't miss the fabled energy of getting involved in the metropolis. I don't miss that at all. What I miss is being out of it.
Thank you.